first patient who I still remember to this day in the OR get the xenotransplant. These were neuronal cells, and then go from being wheelchair bound to running a marathon. And so I had this opportunity to see what it could become, right? What all of this research could lead to. And I was absolutely hooked. And for me, that really started what the early part of my career was, which was in clinical research.
This is the Nucleate Podcast, the voice of the next generation of biotech leaders.
Welcome to the Nucleate Podcast. My name is Sam Kessel, and on this episode, my co-host Elise Stagman and I speak with Jodie Morrison. Jodie is the CEO of Q32 Bio and Venture Advisor at Atlas Ventures. Prior to leading Q32, Jodie was CEO at Tokai, Carix, and Cadent, and she has served on multiple boards of directors. Jodie was named to Boston Business Journal's Power 50 and Women to Watch lists for her outstanding leadership, and she won the Making a Difference for Women Award in 2020. This was a fascinating conversation where we learned about Jodie's leadership of Q32, how she navigates strategic decisions, and how she founded the CEO Forum during the COVID pandemic to support biotech executives and share insights. This conversation was recorded in November 2025, so some of the references are related to when this was recorded. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Jodie, welcome to the podcast. So happy to have you on with Nucleate today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate being here.
So let's start from the beginning. How did you become in science? And do you feel like there are any early defining moments in your life that set you on the path to biotech?
Yeah, quite a few, actually. I think I've always had a high interest in science. That's just been something that's kind of always spoken to me. Biology was probably my area of interest kind of growing up. And when I got to Mount Holyoke, I sort of refocused that a bit. I got interested in a little bit more of sort of broad science, and sort of psychology, chemistry, and biology came together in what became a neuroscience undergrad degree. And so I finished that degree in 97. And the summer of 1996, I got very fortunate to have gone home in the spring of 96 with a college friend whose father happened to be one of the early CEOs in biotech here in Boston. And he was working on a neuro project around xenotransplantation in the early days of xeno, and got to talking to me over dinner, and had the opportunity to then move there that summer of 1996 for an internship and get my first sort of foray into it. At the time, I think I'd been thinking I'd go get my med degree and become a doctor. And I realized over that summer the concept of clinical research and biotech really allowed me to take that science and practically apply it to things that could help thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people if you were in the right indications. And so really shifted my gear and decided to focus on what at the time was a very early sector of biotech, and ended up taking a job with that company, Diacrine, back in 1997 when I graduated.
Awesome. Well, it's so great to hear generally about your journey into biotech. Because you started out in neuroscience and clinical research, how do you feel like that foundation really shaped your decision making now as a CEO?
Yeah, great question. I think that for me, the Diacrine experience was an interesting one. It wasn't that long. I was there, I don't know, three years maybe. And I started at the labs, working in the labs and doing some of the work, the animal work we were doing, running some of the models, and ended up having the opportunity, frankly, because of an allergy to rats, to get into the clinical research side of things, and was able to actually help write the IND for the project I had been working on in stroke, and then move into clinical with it and be the clinical research associate for the stroke program. Which allowed me to watch our very first patient, who I still remember to this day, in the OR get the xenotransplant. These were neuronal cells, and then go from being wheelchair bound to running a marathon. And so I had this opportunity to see what it could become, right? What all of this research could lead to. And I was absolutely hooked. And for me, that really started what the early part of my career was, which was in clinical research. And so I kind of came up through that, ending at my time at Tokai as head of clinical and VP. And then from there moved into the broader responsibilities of COO and eventually CEO of private and then public. And I've now done that, multiple times. As a CEO. And I think it shapes my thinking because a couple things. One, I came up from the bottom, right? I grew up in a company. I didn't jump in at a director or VP level after getting a PhD or an MD. I came up from the bottom. And so I think as a leader, I really think about everybody in the company and all levels of the company and try to build a culture such that there's access to leadership, exposure to kind of the big thinking that's happening in the executive room. And I think also I'm a really good CEO for clinical stage companies because of my background. That's really where my sweet spot is. I've done earlier, I've done commercial. Those have refined my thinking around clinical stage companies. But kind of my heart and soul and the place I play best is definitely the clinical stage for companies.
And I think you can argue that that's the heart and soul of a lot of biotech companies, right? A lot of the money comes in to fund clinical trials after the science has been de-risked, and that's where, there's a lot of risk in a clinical trial too to prove out whether a drug actually works in patients. So I think that foundational experience in clinical development I can understand to be critically important. And really, you mentioned it. You came up as the COO role, which I think is unique compared to some of the other folks that we've spoken to. And I'm assuming that's pretty similar too, right? It's a lot of the nuts and bolts of building a company as the chief operating officer. I'm curious if you can talk a little more about that and how that shapes your foundation as CEO now.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, every COO job that I've ever been exposed to is slightly different. They're all a little bit different, what sectors they oversee, which departments report into them, and generally the full definition of operations. Sometimes it can be very manufacturing focused, sometimes it can be broader. In the case of my experience, it was an extension of the role that I had running clinical. So I still had clinical under me. And I took on a sector of other portions of the company. So I had QC under me, I had manufacturing under me, I owned all of program management. Small companies, you can wear lots of hats, right? So I really was sort of running the operations of the company, managing the timeline, but from a strategic standpoint, then making the strategic decisions on behalf of the company for how we needed to sort of pivot and make changes in order to stay on path. So that a lot of that fell to me. So if there were delays in manufacturing, I was responsible for thinking about how clinical could make up for that and vice versa. So that was sort of a piece of the puzzle for me. And it definitely played a role into, both my eventual, rising into the CEO level, but also how I approach things. I have a pretty wide remit of different experience from that COO role of overseeing departments that were way out of my expertise, right? CMC is not my expertise, but you oversee it and you've got good people in it and you can trust the people you have, to kind of level up when they need to and share the information with you so that you can make the strategic decisions on behalf of the manufacturing team, even if you're not the resident expert. And in a lot of ways, that's the job of a CEO, right? You have to be able to go deep when you need to, but rise up and think strategically across the organization.
That's excellent. And I want to fast forward a little bit. So you spent 10 years at Tokai. You rose up from COO to CEO. You also spent time at Carix. But I want to fast forward a little bit to Q32 and I say many other companies in between too, right? Very impressive track record beforehand. So I'm curious on how you eventually came to Q32 via Atlas as a venture partner, and what was that like, and how you ended up joining Q32 in the first place.
Yeah, the story of my joining Q32 is actually fairly similar to my story joining a number of companies since Tokai. I think oftentimes people have brought me in when there's a need to make a change in an organization, shift leadership, or someone's leaving. And Q32 was no different than that. There was an opportunity to step in initially as the acting CEO. That had been my intent, was just to jump in. I was at the time, as you know, serving as an Atlas venture partner, sort of working on boards and different projects for them. And this one came up as, there's a need for someone to step in here and help stabilize things. Happens to be something I'm good at. People define it as a smoke jumper role, and it's something I've done a number of times. So I jumped in, worked with the leadership team, kind of stabilized things. And along the way, we had the opportunity through the Homology merger to take the company public. And as part of that, there was a desire and a need for me to stay on, right? You don't want to go public and then transition the CEO rather quickly. And it was the right thing for the company. And so ultimately decided to stay with the company through the readouts that happened last year. One of our readouts didn't go the way we wanted it to. So now I'm working to stabilize and move the company through that in the role of CEO. So that's how I came into it. And it's now been 3.5 years of building the company, getting it public. running our initial programs that had been running when I got there, and now running some additional program work and working on an out licensing project as well.
I wanted to ask a follow-up question on that. You said that Q32 was a company that needed some stability and that that was something you had been really successful in bringing to companies. Is there any common thread between the companies that you've been involved in that really inspires you and makes you want to jump in and get involved?
It's always about the people for me. I think that at the heart of it, I'm a people person, and I like people, and I like to try to figure out how to get the best out of people. And I like the challenge of thinking about different personalities. I'm a big Myers-Briggs person, a big insight person. I like to think about how that all fits together. And so I think generally what I've found in a number of the companies I've gone into is that there really is a need to, stabilize things through that lens of like, how do we get people to work together for the greater good of the organization? Sometimes it's around mission driven discussions, right? So really focusing on the mission, focusing on the patients, thinking about what the end goal is, because I think that can diffuse challenges that exist within companies and teams. So that can play a big role. But for me, I think that the big driving factor tends to be the people. I've had the great fortune, I think, across my career to work on indications that had personal meaning to me, whether it be somebody in my family, a dear friend, that had one of the conditions we were taking forward. I think that played a big role. So for me, we have the great fortune, I think, in biotech to work in a sector where you put these long days in, and you're putting all these hours in, and it's not just numbers on a spreadsheet. We're trying to save people's lives. We're trying to improve people's quality of living. And we're trying to prevent disease, right? Like there's such a good feeling about that at the end of the day. And I think that's true for me. I'm kind of indication agnostic about companies. I'm not like only a neuro person, though I love neuro, but I'm not only a neuro person. I'm not only an oncology person because I worked for 10 years plus at the Tokai story. So I think that, I've been able to go across indications because I hire really smart people, or I inherit them in a lot of cases, who are the resident experts on that specialty or that therapeutic area. And I'm able to sort of learn what I need to strategically make the decisions, but surround myself with A-plus players who know all the ins and outs of an indication or a therapeutic area, or any kind of target we're working on, or the CMC, going back to that example, right? Whatever that is, I am somebody who tries to hire the absolute smartest people, and they're always smarter than me, always, in their therapeutic area or their specialty, I should say.
That's really useful context. And I think one thing that you've touched on a little bit is that you've had to come into these more challenging circumstances. You come into a company that may have faced a setback, and you had to navigate that challenge and pivot the company. I mean, you mentioned it in the context of Q32. You mentioned it in the context of other companies you've worked at as well. So I'm sure a lot of the points that you just highlighted apply to those challenging situations as well. But I'm curious on how, when you're thrown in to the deep end of the pool, it sounds like a bunch of times into challenging situations, there's no clear playbook. The team may be demoralized. You may have faced a setback. How do you navigate those situations?
Yeah, I think it's a silly analogy, but as you were talking, I was thinking it's like buying a house, right? I'm somebody who buys fixer-uppers. My husband's sick of it. We're not going to do it anymore, but we've bought a lot of fixer-uppers over the years. And if the bones are good, right, I can see through that. I can see through whatever else is a mess and say the bones are good, and this is worthwhile to do. And I think it's true with companies too, right? Are the bones good? Is the target a good target? Is the asset a good asset, or the idea, if there's not yet an asset, are they good ideas? And there are certain VCs I've worked with, Atlas being one of them, right, where I have a lot of faith and trust in their expertise in picking assets. And I think when it comes to building teams, I trust my own judgment on that. And I believe if you've got the right foundation, you can build an excellent team from there. So I think it really comes down to, are the bones good in the company? It's kind of a simple way to put it, but I think that's what it is. Do you have the raw material you need to build something that could be really valuable? And in the cases of the ones I've stepped into, I certainly believe that that's been the case.
So you've spoken a lot about identifying problems that really can help a lot of people, and sort of focusing a company around that. Q32 aims to provide treatment options for devastating autoimmune disorders, many of them without cures. How did Q32 choose to focus on this particular area?
Yeah, so originally the company was founded around the complement therapeutics side of the house. The data was really intriguing, and working with some of the KOLs in the space, we really looked at that and thought this could really be a big difference for patients, right? These patients right now have really one therapeutic class of drugs for treatment, which are JAKs. They work exceptionally well, but they come with black box warnings that for patients who are on average 40 years old, taking on that black box warning, that set of black box issues, I think is a big ask for those patients. And we know that if patients go off JAKs, their hair tends to fall out. So it's not something where they can cycle. And what we saw in our data set was super intriguing, right? We had data that was showing not only could we grow hair, which is exceedingly hard to do and not something placebo does more than 5 to 10% of the time, right? So you have a good shot knowing this is a great opportunity to move forward. But also you have a biologic with a safety profile that is very, very different from the class of drugs these patients have access to. This summer, I had the opportunity to join one of the Massachusetts alopecia areata walks for patients. And I had such an interesting experience watching all these kids, right? These young kids that don't have hair or have very little hair, running around and just thinking to myself, I always focus in my mind on the 40-year-old average patient. But you're thinking about these kids going on these types of drugs that have black box warnings. It's just unacceptable for patients. And so for me, that's where this takes the lead. And I think so we've not only followed the science, but followed the data. And we feel really encouraged by the direction that we're headed in here. We'll see what the data shows. We have a larger data set that'll come out mid-year next year that we're running through right now. And we're pretty excited about the early days of that. So I think we focused initially on the full therapeutic area. Right now, we're focused on a sole asset and alopecia areata and contemplating how we can grow that over time appropriately.
And I think those patients do have significant unmet needs with alopecia in terms of baldness, and it does affect a lot of their self-esteem and how they're perceived by others. Yeah. So this drug could have pretty significant impact on their lives, to the point that you're getting in even children, even if they're not the typical patient.
Yeah. I mean, obviously we'll go for adults first. Children will come later, but I think that biologics are such a perfect fit for these patients when you think about the safety profile. And it's the one indication where JAKs are available right now where there is not a biologic alternative. And in all the cases where JAKs are on the market, the biologics take the first position for exactly the reason you're talking about.
So when you're thinking of the long term for Q32, what would be the ideal world, right? We're looking 5 years in the future. What is your greatest hope for Q32 within alopecia, or in addition to other autoimmune disorders, with the broader context of what you all have been doing?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we'll come down to the data in alopecia areata. That'll be the building block for the future. Presuming that is positive, we're looking to move this into pivotal clinical programs immediately thereafter and trying to get it to patients as quickly as possible. Along the way, I think with success there, we'll have the opportunity, especially as a public company, to raise additional capital where appropriate to expand our pipeline and grow the company as appropriate.
Awesome. Well, it's super awesome to hear from you about Q32 and everything going on there. We also wanted to get your advice for some of our listeners and new biotech founders who might just be entering business or starting a company. So in addition to leading Q32, you started the CEO Forum to support executives during the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you speak to how that group came together and what you're doing today?
Yeah. Wasn't intentional. It wasn't I set out to build a social network of biotech executives, but it did happen to fill a need, I think, in the sector that I wasn't expecting. So during the early days of COVID, I was working at Cadent Therapeutics. We eventually sold that one to Novartis back in 21, but in March of 2020, I was working for them, and we had been at a conference, a bank conference, and we had overlapped with Biogen, which had a potential outbreak in the early days, many of us remember, around a COVID outbreak. So we were out super early. We were out maybe March 3rd or 4th of 2020. We called the office out because at that time, right, none of us knew how it was transmitted. We didn't know if we had brought it back to the office. So we decided to take everyone remote. And so we went remote March of 2020. And I was at home receiving a lot of really, useful emails from board members and investors on what other companies were doing. Some were relevant to me, right? Clinical stage companies. Some weren't, right? What to do with your vivarium, what to do if you were manufacturing at the time, different things like that. And so I wrote back to a few of these, the ones at Atlas in particular, and said, why don't you give me all the Atlas CEOs, and I'll pull us together and we'll build subgroups around the things that are relevant to us, right? If we have a lab, if we have a clinical trial, if we have a vivarium, and we'll, if we're looking to submit to FDA for a commercial asset, right? All of those things we can segment it off. So originally, I think it was around, I always get the numbers wrong, but it was somewhere plus or minus 10 to 15 people that were on that list and on that first call that we did in early March. We agreed at that time that it would not be specific to Atlas CEOs. Within a week, that had grown to over 50. Within 2 weeks, it was over 100. We're now more than 350 CEOs. So it just has continued to kind of organically grow. We don't charge dues. It's all run by volunteers. Graciously, my EA, who was working for me at the time, who had worked for me at Tokai, has stayed with me to run this despite not working with me currently at Q32. She's currently working at Cheming, and they've graciously allowed her to continue to support the forum. So, shout out to Holly Schlichting, but she's kept the list and managed all of that along with Tracy Dembro, who volunteered to help coordinate a lot of our subcommittees. So our subcommittees are chaired by other CEOs or CEO appointees who have been part of the forum. So CEOs can appoint someone, a COO, a CBO, a CTO, to join the forum on their behalf, a CFO. Head of HR sometimes is a person that gets appointed, and we allow those folks to stay in at their, at the direction of their CEO. So we have multiple subcommittees right now. We've managed a lot of things. During active COVID, it was about how do we get a testing facility up in Cambridge to let people get back to work that needed to get back to work. And we had members of the community that pulled that together. We then pulled together a vaccine clinic and got people vaccinated in the early days before it was sort of as easily accessible. And there were huge wait lines at places like CVS. So we were able to do that. We also pulled together, different subcommittees on clinical trials, on CMC, on overseas manufacturing, on the ethics of running clinical trials. And importantly, I think, and this one has stuck over the years, HR topics at the time related to COVID. That migrated over time to reintegration of people to your offices subsequent to COVID or as COVID was winding down. Remote work schedules has always been something I'm a big advocate of. I've worked 1 day a week at home for 20 years. So I'm I'm an early adopter. And so we wanted to talk about what that would look like for companies moving forward. And we're probably shaking out on average at 3 days in the office, 2 days from home. That seems to be, probably the average, at least of the folks in the forum. And now we're dealing with a lot of public policy issues for obvious reasons, right? So there's public policies, there's Biotech at Work, which manages the sort of HR issues on a go-forward basis. And we're also focused on Bio Gives Back, which is a group that started with COVID relief funding and now is focused on things like supporting groups like Life Science Cares, and others who are, raising capital or looking for volunteers to support the community that we all live in. So Boston is home to about 75% of the forum members. We've got about 10 to 15% in California and some international folks as well, and a few up and down the coast. And so it's, it's largely New England based, and that's likely because I set it at 7:30 in the morning back in March of 2020, because it doesn't interfere with schedules. So we've continued that. But we send out the mailing list to everybody that doesn't attend the now monthly calls that we have. And each committee reports out at those calls. We have sort of best practices for CEOs as well. And so those 4 committees, which are the 4 we have right now, read out every month. And typically 1 or 2 of them will have speakers or major topics that we will debate, be it public policy issues, be it issues with HR, how to manage your board, how to deal with board transitions when you go public. So we have a lot of different topics in there, but all CEOs are welcome.
it sounds like it's become a fantastic resource. It was built around, the crisis of the pandemic and really having to organize, in a crisis and solve pressing problems. But now it sounds like it's really evolved, 5 years later, into something that's a support group. It's an advisory team. It's a peer group. And, I've heard the saying that the CEO job is one of the loneliest jobs just because of the unique nature of it, running a company. So having peers who are in similar positions at different companies, I assume, can be really helpful if you're, even just need some personal advice. You're trying to make a critical decision and you're torn on what to do. I'm sure having good friends who are in similar positions is helpful as you go through those types of situations.
Yeah, we talk about it a lot amongst, friends of mine who I've kind of grown up in the industry with. Like when I became a CEO, there weren't a lot of female CEOs, and I didn't know other CEOs. I wasn't planning on being a CEO. I hadn't been being mentored to be a CEO. I had dinner recently with one of the kind of the first that at least I remember CEOs in biotech, which was Deborah Dunsire from Millennium Takeda. And or I guess she was technically Millennium pre-Takeda, but and she was like, I wish you'd picked up the phone and called me. And I was like, I didn't even know how to find you, right? Like it was just like we didn't have a community to go through. And so I've been very mindful and thoughtful about that throughout my career. First focused kind of on female executives as we're growing into these roles and thinking about how to do that. I was part of the Mass Bio Gender Diversity Initiative in the early days. And I think the forum kind of grows out of that interest, to exactly your point, Sam, because it is a lonely job. And I think when COVID hit, one of the things when we were kind of booting this up that was very top of mind for me is at that point I had been a CEO, I think 5 times or 4 times, I guess at that point. And a pandemic, I had no idea what to do, right? Not a clue. That was not something that was on my plan for, 2020 like everybody else. And I kept thinking, like, if this was the first time I was doing this, right, I would feel so alone in trying to manage through this and feeling like everything I was doing was going to screw something up and that I was failing as a CEO, despite the fact that 4-time CEOs also didn't know what to do. And so I just felt that there was strength in numbers. And it turns out, I think that that's very true for lots of topics, right? And to have a community you can go to. I have been blessed with a lot of really good friends who sit in CEO roles now. I have my own kind of personal board of advisors I can go to and debate things. And we're all facing things we haven't seen before all the time. No matter how many times you've done this, no company is alike, no challenge is alike, no people you work with are alike, no investors are the same, right? So it's a constantly evolving role. And so having people who may have had experiences you didn't have that you could ask those questions of, I think is really important. And I think the forum provides that in particular to people that don't yet have their own network. And I try to serve as a go-between for people who maybe don't want to put their company out there. So we have a WhatsApp where sometimes I'll be seen saying, hey, we have a member looking to talk to a couple people with experience like this. We don't want to identify the company name, but if you have this experience and are willing to talk, I'll put you in touch. So we aren't publicizing that company A is, firing their whatever, their CMO, their chair of the board, whatever, but they need somebody's advice, and so we can do that through the WhatsApp exceedingly fast, and it's a very active group. There's constantly people asking for, do you know somebody that does this? A resource that can do that? I need a fractional CMO. We're looking for an independent board member. Whatever it is, it can get posted there, and I think that's been a great community for that. And I think the CEO Sisterhood works very similarly, which I'm part of. There's a great community of female executives there, ready to support each other all the time, which is a beautiful evolution from the days where, it was a couple of us, probably Adeline and Deborah, myself, and maybe some others I didn't know about at the time, but I didn't know how to find any of them. And so I'm really happy with the evolution of both the CEO Forum and the Sisterhood to improve upon that for everybody.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you about that. So you mentioned that when you became a CEO, there really weren't a lot of other women CEOs around you, and that you have built an infrastructure for that in a lot of ways. Is there anything that you would hope to see from the next generation of women in biotechnology?
I don't think it's specific to biotechnology, but I think women have to give back, right? I think we have to, lift while we climb and bring people with us. I'm a firm believer of the importance of that. So I think that, I'm giving back to a community that's been incredibly good to me through the forum and through volunteering now for 5 years to run this thing and coordinate it. My sort of ask and my hopefully expectation of people that are benefiting from it is that they find their ways to give back to others, because the industry is really a great place to be. It's a good place to work. It's a good place, frankly, for women to work. And I think that for me, right, I raised two daughters who are now, they would say full-fledged adults. And, there were times I traveled a lot and I wasn't home and I had to make concessions with the balance of my own life. And working in an industry where, at the end of the day, you're trying to help hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people suffering from a disease, we have the benefit of realizing there's a trade-off that maybe has the math that works, if you will. We're very fortunate in that way. And so the more we can help people get through it, I'm also very vocal and very, upfront about how I made that work as a mom, right? I think you come up thinking you're supposed to hide the fact that you're a mom or you're not supposed to talk about your kids, but it's a huge part of our lives for many of us, not all, but for many of us. And so I'm pretty transparent with other female CEOs about what worked for me and, how it all came together, what I regret, what I wish I'd done differently. I'm pretty open about that. So for the next gen of female leaders, frankly, in any sector, but certainly in biotech, and certainly those that are benefiting from places like the Sisterhood and the CEO Forum, my hope is that they will figure out how to do that in even better ways, moving forward. Like we're working with what we've got right now, just as Deborah and Adeline and others were doing when I became a CEO. We worked with what we had. Mass Bio was a good example of that during my early years. But, every generation has an opportunity to bring along new ways to improve upon it. AI is, obviously kind of overtaking things right now, and the ability to learn how to harness that for our jobs and teaching that to others, I think that's another important piece that the next gen can play a much bigger role in.
Definitely. AI seems like it could be presenting huge shifts for you as a CEO. Is it something that you've addressed in the CEO forum?
It is something we're planning to address. We have plans to tackle that in 2026. I am right now taking a class that graciously another dear friend of mine has her CTO teaching a series of CEOs right now. Some basic skills around AI because we feel we're getting left behind, and it is mind blowing. It's just one of the best classes I've taken in a very long time, and huge thanks to the person who's doing it, who I won't say, or everyone will call him, but eventually they'll meet him because he's probably going to come to the forum and talk about what he's been doing with us. But it's been eye-opening. There's so much I didn't appreciate or understand about AI, how to utilize it, how to harness it, how to do it in the safest way. And so, I think it's certainly important for us all to not get left behind and to figure out how to utilize these new tools, which are amazing, right, to improve how we do our jobs. And I think that will only grow from here.
And I want to dig in a little bit. I don't want to spend a ton of time on AI, but maybe one more question on it. How do you see it currently being used within your role or within your community? I could see, there's a lot of tech-enabled biotechs who are using AI for drug discovery. AI proteins is a good example of that. But I think there's a lot of critical enabling roles that AI can play within what you consider more traditional biotech, right? So that can be accelerating clinical submissions. It could be used for internal communications. It can be used to, impact trial designs. Like even if you're not necessarily designing a drug from scratch using AI, you can see a lot of ways where it can accelerate pretty much everything that a company does. So I'm curious on your perspectives on that and how, if not formally addressed yet, curious on what you're hearing from your peers in the CEO forum there.
Yeah, I think that there is a desire to use it, but a reluctance to fully understand how to best implement it, how to safely implement it with confidential information. So I think there's public companies versus private, different considerations, certainly when it comes to that. And companies that are large enough, right, to have a CTO who's an expert in AI that can enable it. I think the reality is that people are using it. People are putting questions in, whether you've taught them or not, right? So you have to teach them in order to protect your confidential information. And to your point, yeah, you can use it in all sorts of AI-enabled drug discovery points, but there's also very simple things you can do, which is effectively buying you time, right? As a CEO, my biggest commodity is my time, right? I don't have enough time in the day to do everything I would like to do to the 100th percentile goal, right? And so you're always making trade-offs with your time. What is the priority today, right? I'm going to go deep on this thing because there's a crisis, and that means I'm not going to do these 6 things that I was going to do today. There's always something to take up your time. And so if you can use AI to help you draft a speech for an all hands, if you want to, like one of the things we've been doing recently is taking just confidential or non-confidential information about competitors and saying, build me talking points for my board, for my employees, for the KOLs about the differential between these 2 things based on publicly available information. And if you prompt that right, that's a 2-sentence version of what is like a 14-paragraph prompt within Claude that we do. But you can really get amazing outputs, and you have to cross-check it all. It's not all perfect, and there's definitely some issues with it we all know about. But the amount of time you spend on it is drastically reduced, right? Versus what you would spend if you were trying to unearth all of that data, get it into a form you liked, put it into PowerPoint, all of those things. And so you can really save a lot of time just with basic things like that. All hands meetings, and I want to do an all hands meeting to talk about, whatever. Give me examples of this, and then you refine it, right? It can really change your perspective. I recently gave a speech that I put a long prompt in, and AI wrote the first draft, and then I did a ton of work, making it fit exactly the way I wanted it to, but it probably saved me 5 hours of time with a prompt that, took me 10 minutes to write. Right. So I think there are some basic premises as far as time management that will be remarkable. And if I can do that, so can my ET members, and so can their VPs, and so can their directors, right? We can all work better. We just have to train people around how to prompt, how to use it, how to safely use it, and how to cross-check it, right? I think those are the pieces that are still, we all hear the horror stories of people putting stuff together and the data's wrong or some patent didn't exist or whatever. Like, we have to do our work too. But I think we can gain a lot of momentum in companies just from the ability to have extra hands on deck, if you will, through the use of AI properly.
Definitely. I think AI has grown so much in usage and its ability to accelerate scientific discovery and then also make workplaces work more effectively. So it's super interesting to hear how you're already implementing it for your work. Um, on the more technical side of things at Q32, you've noted before how investors often fixate on a single lead asset in pharmaceuticals, undervaluing whole platforms. How do you navigate this landscape?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Q32, our platform is part of our out licensing strategy right now, so probably not the right example to speak to. But I think in general, investors, there's always a swing, right? Sometimes investors are particularly interested in platforms. Sometimes platform plays are in vogue, right? But by and large, when times are tough, which the last couple of years they have been, there is a desire to focus and make sure you're driving the single biggest value driver for the organization, which is often a single asset or a single indication or an asset in multiple indications, just because the cost per asset is so high, right? So at times when you need to consolidate cash and extend your runway, that makes a lot of sense. And so I think, for those of us that have clinical stage assets that have data, it becomes easy to pick your favorite, right? Who's your favorite child today is typically the one that has the data that tells you there's value that you can build from. And that's exactly what Q32 is doing with bempikibart. We have high belief in the value of bempikibart. Despite being very disappointed by the placebo effect in our atopic dermatitis, our drug arm performed exceedingly well and all of our biomarkers were hit. And so as we think about, moving forward in our alopecia areata, we're focused there right now based on the capital we have. We're able to get, into 2027 and through our data readouts. But, with additional capital, there's a wealth of other indications we can go to just with that asset, right? So that's a bit of a bridge from the story of a single asset, single indication, but it often is a comfortable one, even in times of conservation because it's still the same asset, it's still the same manufacturing, it's still the same therapeutic target team, and you're just expanding on indications like, ulcerative colitis, or, looking back at AD or looking at other indications like RA where this type of a mechanism could play. And so I think you can expand from there. And often that's sort of a step in a direction that's comfortable even in those times of conservation, as long as you have clinical data. So I think clinical data is easier. Platform companies, more challenging, right? When they're still trying to get to their first asset. And we're seeing some companies in that sector struggle right now, unfortunately. And I think I believe, lose some really good ideas that could have been great drug generators because of that. But it's cyclical, and hopefully we'll then build on that for the next generation, right? I worked on the first generation of xenotransplant. The world looks like it's headed in a direction where we're going to see the next gen of that in a very different direction these days. And so, we see these things come and go, right? Whether it's because of FDA positioning, which in the case of xenotransplant, I think played a big role, or in the case of investor sentiment for a sector or a therapeutic target. I mean, we've seen the pharmas love and hate neuro and decide they're going to lob off their neuro, and then they decide they're going to focus in neuro, right? So it's not dissimilar. I think ultimately we see therapeutic targets become a focus at times. Precision medicine went through its heyday, right? Genetic medicine went through its heyday, right? And then had its trouble and then went through a heyday again, right? So we see these cycles. So my view is you have to look at what you've got, and as a CEO, you have to read the tea leaves for what's out there, but you also have to drive for the place you think you can find value. If that's in multiple places, or if that's in a platform, you have to believe in what you're doing, and hopefully you can find people that come along with you. In the case of clinical stage assets, if we had 2 clinical stage assets with great data, I'd be out marching around trying to get every single one. But we had one without clinical data in patients and one with data in clinical patients. So we're out licensing the one that didn't have the clinical patient data yet.
And you've touched on this topic, perhaps indirectly or, as a side, that, a lot of things are dependent on investor sentiment. And as of fall of 2025, I'd say public markets are starting to rebound a little bit, although they've been down in the dumps for quite a while. Yeah, certainly for, the companies I've been speaking to, because I enter some nucleate companies and some companies from Lab Central, especially these are earlier stage companies, but seed and Series A's are still very hard to come by. So I'm curious on how you think about it from the perspective of the companies you've worked for, even though they tend to be on the larger side. How do you navigate some of those more challenging investor sentiment situations? How do you make sure you're, like you're saying, focusing on creating value when you're having a hard time getting the capital to do those key killer experiments? What would your advice be to a seed or Series A stage entrepreneur in the nucleate audience who's trying to navigate these challenging capital markets now?
Yeah, I mean, I think don't live above your means, I guess I would say, right? I think we all want to build the best companies we can, but what we can build does depend on how much capital we're able to raise. And so the days of presuming you can raise that next big round are not upon us at the moment. Hopefully they'll come back. We've seen days where you can feel much more strong about the ability to do so. But I think you have to really be thinking about how to build something that has the most value, that's going to speak to the investors you will need, right, to get to the next stage. And sometimes that's not the cool science, and it's not the killer experiment, unless that's the one that investors have told you they want to see. And I think, having not been, a scientist, I came in through, bench science, but I'm not a PhD scientist. It's easier for me sometimes to take that tactic. Because there's always more experiments you can run. There's always deeper dives you can do. And sometimes you really need to focus on what is the thing that's going to get me to the next step. And if I do that successfully, I can backfill, right? And that can get you in trouble too. So there's a balance, right? There's always a balance, and you have to cross-check yourself on, if I do just this one experiment, right, and it goes wrong, I may be dead in the water. So maybe I need to do 2 to have a backup, right? But I probably don't need to do all 5 that we could do, right? So there's the kind of the balance of that. But I think you have to be thinking about kind of the 3-dimensional chess game that is investor, discussions and raising capital. And as a CEO, it's one of your biggest jobs, right? Raising capital and managing your board and then managing down into the company, making strategic decisions. That's kind of the roundup if you think about it. And raising capital is a huge part of our job. And that's not just I'm raising capital today. It's I'm raising capital in my head all the time. Like, when am I going to raise capital next? When do I need to raise capital next? And what can I do to extend that runway in a down cycle like this, right? Q32 had intended, right, if we had positive data last year, to be moving into phase 2 and expected to be having different conversations than we were at the end of last year, certainly. But we have stretched our capital and we've been able to really, design a new study, get that data out in time before our capital runs out and really give it its best shot on goal. And we're doing things to work on extending that runway even more. But I think good financial planning and disciplined thinking about what you really have to do and what are the nice to haves is really what it comes down to.
Definitely. It seems that in your role, you're often making huge decisions about the direction of the company, maybe based on data or previous experience, or experiments. Um, I'm sure you've had to make many challenging decisions under pressure. So what advice would you give to founders, maybe in our audience, who are learning how to make these decisions better?
At least for me, I think one of the biggest lessons was you have to take out the emotion. We can, really love our teams, right? You build amazing teams, and sometimes you have to make decisions to change your team or to, simplify your team. That's a really hard thing to do. I think the same is true for our assets, right? You kind of fall in love with your asset along the way, and you really drink the Kool-Aid. And I think that as a CEO, that's what you have to do, right? We have to be the biggest champions for our assets. That is our job. We have to go out and talk about why people should invest in these assets. And if we don't believe that, we're in trouble, right? So we've got to believe that. But there are times where you have to step back and take a 10,000-foot view. And sometimes you got to lob something off and it's painful. So I think you have to take out the emotion. You have to look at it through a logical lens. And different people are better than that than others, right? Just naturally. And some people, it takes a little bit more to kind of really take that lens to things. But I think it ultimately doesn't come down to the thing you like the best or the people you like the best. It has to come down to the strategic decisions that carry forward the company, carry forward the asset, and do right by investors. That's the job, right? We have a fiduciary responsibility to our investors. I always feel like I have an ethical obligation to my employees, and that's an important one to me. But sometimes that can mean I have to make the decision to do layoffs now, or I won't be able to pay out everything I need to pay out to keep people whole until they find their next job. And there are plenty of examples, I think, of companies that took that too far. And didn't have the funding to pay out their employees at the end, right? And so you have to be thinking a few steps ahead. And if you do that, even those really hard decisions, in particular when it comes to personnel, can be justified as the right decision from that ethical lens. But I always go back to that. My fiduciary responsibility is to my employees, or excuse me, to my investors.
Yeah, and I actually want to touch on that a little bit more. That's something that's come up with some of the other CEOs that we've spoken to before. We actually have spoken to Deborah Dunsire on the podcast, so shout out to her. She's fabulous. I really liked her take on how critically important it is, to your point, on the ethical responsibility to your employees. If you do have the unfortunate situation where you have to make a layoff decision, that you treat your employees as well as you possibly can, with respect, with kindness, with the gratitude that they're due. And then she gave, I think, the smaller examples of like making sure that people were allowed to go to the holiday party before they left. And things like those small things, those small acts of kindness do go a really long way. So I'm curious, when you've been in those very challenging situations, having to let people go, how do you navigate those to maintain morale for the people who stay and, to show respect to the people who do end up getting laid off?
Yeah, I don't think I do it perfectly all the time. I try really hard to do it in a respectful way, and to, do right by the employees on their way out, right? To try to provide them a soft landing, to make sure there's enough capital in the company to give them proper severance packages, to respect their time in the company if they're long-term and long tenured employees. I try to stay in touch with them. I try to help them find their next jobs if they're willing to let me. Sometimes they're frustrated by a layoff and they don't want that help, but if they do, I'm happy to do it. And I'm happy to report I've got a lot of folks that have come back and worked for me, even after, a layoff that involved them. I think the more you can segregate, this isn't personal, right? This is a strategic decision. And I think part of that comes to being direct with people about what's really causing the layoff. And in small companies, it's not a strategic decision to wind down the neuro group, right? Which is the simple answer that if you're a large company, you might be able to give. In a company, like Q32, right? We did a layoff in February. It was because of the outcome. I don't think there was an employee in the company not expecting that there would be layoffs. We had been direct with employees that, our capital only went so far. And if it didn't hit where we wanted it to, we were going to have to make tough decisions, but we would try to do it in the, fairest way possible. And so that is, sort of the approach we took there. And I've had to do layoffs after the Tokai, when Tokai hit the phase 3 failure, and we had to stop early. That was a similar one. We were direct with people. It was heartbreaking. Like, I got up in front of the company and cried. This was terrible. I hate that stuff. I hate laying people off, but you have to make the right decisions for your investors at the end of the day. And you try to preserve as much capital, in particular, in the example of Bempikibart, to have an opportunity to give Bempi another shot. That's the job, right? At the end of the day, that is the job. But you can do it in a humane way, and people can always come back. That we've had multiple people, say they wish they could come back, right, if times change. And I think that's a testament to the approach we took and the way we, respect our employees even when they go. We want to see the best for them. We really do.
So Jodie, you covered the challenges with layoffs and how important it is to be respectful to your employees, and talking about experiences where you've done it. We know that there's been a lot of layoffs in the industry, on and off over time, especially with the restrictive capital markets. I'm curious on, you mentioned some employees do return back to their own company someday, or a lot of them do go to other biotech companies. But do you have any concern about talent and retention in the biotech industry as a whole? Are people leaving the industry entirely? Is that a concern that you face in terms of talent in biotech with the layoffs and challenging capital markets that we faced?
Yeah, I think that that's going to have to be a concern for all of us, right? We've had a couple years in a row now of substantial layoffs across the industry. I think we're seeing, thankfully, a little bit of a resurgence, certainly in the public markets, but then you layer with that, right? NIH cuts, you layer in, some of the grant cuts that are happening across the board at a lot of the feeders for employees and ideas, right, for biotech. That's a challenge, right? So where are our PhDs going to come from when there were supposed to be 80 at an institution one year and there's 13, right? Eventually that's going to catch up with us and we're not going to have the workforce. And the folks that are part of these layoff cycles now are having to think about different sectors. Should they look at another sector, right? And so if we don't see a recovery here pretty soon, I think we are going to be at risk of a shortfall of employees. We know back in 2021 when things were booming, in 2022, it was really hard to find talent, right, for the pool of companies we had. And that pool of companies, I would argue, were great ideas, right? So some of those ideas aren't going to get funded right now because of the funding situation. And some of those employees, maybe we've hit a point where you're balancing with the talent that exists today, but our talent feeder is getting short on staff. And so I think we've got some issues coming in the future if we don't see a course correction soon. And with all the layoffs we're seeing, I do know of examples of people, in particular in areas, call it finance, call it even regulatory is very, cross-functional, manufacturing. Those folks can move to other sectors, right? Where there's manufacturing, where there's regulatory considerations, where there's writing requirements, et cetera. And so I think you've got cross-functional skills people can take to other industries. And so, if this doesn't let up, more considerate. If we come out of JP Morgan, we finally see a rising tide, I'll feel a little better about it. But you're still going to have the issue with the feeders being problematic under the current constraints as far as grant funding for a lot of our academic institutions around the country.
Yeah, I think we covered early stage funding, from the venture capitalists, and yeah, grant funding too, right? That's critical for those earlier stages of science. It's where a lot of people get trained and learn, and where they ultimately end up moving into industry. So that agree, especially with what Nucleate does, that is critically important.
Yeah, and we're seeing that across the board.
So when you're talking about the industry as a whole, and I'm thinking broader than just capital markets, the current restrictive situation we're seeing, especially on the earlier stage side, thinking more broadly, and you think about the broader trend of where we are in biotech now, what is your sense of the pulse of it, just based on, you're built the CEO forum, all of these executives and VCs and everyone in the industry, putting the capital markets part aside, when you're looking at, let's say, the next medium term, 2 to 5 years, what's the sense of, what's the tone? What's the view on the promise of biotech looking forward a few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think biotech will continue to have its home. That's my belief. And I think that's generally the belief of the people I talk to the most. How healthy the industry as a whole will be, I think, is the bigger question, right? I think we are living at the moment in an environment that is less science positive than I've ever seen, certainly in my life. It's been a shocking about face post COVID, I think, for many of us to see. And I think that has made it hard to know really how far this could go with restrictions and policies and changes. On the flip side, I think there's hope, right? We've had listening tours with the FDA. They're trying to modernize a lot of the work that they're doing. We'll see how successful they are with that. And I think I have to believe, and we talk about this a lot in groups that I play in, at least, that at the end of the day, everybody gets sick, right? So it doesn't matter your politics. People get sick. People get cancer. People get health issues. And so at the end of the day, the medications we have right now aren't sufficient, for every indication we're targeting. There's a lot of work to be done and a lot of advancement that needs to happen. So I have to believe that will continue to motivate people in the direction of biotech and pharma. We're not a perfect industry. We have work to do there. I think, we need to figure out how to solve the interface between drugs and drug pricing and insurance companies, PBMs, all of that. There's a lot of work to be done there. And I think that plays into the anti-biotech, anti-pharma sentiment. It's probably more pharma than biotech, but it bleeds to biotech. So I think the general sentiment is cautious optimism. I think we're hopeful that there's a counterbalance to what's been happening, which is the reality of disease in humans, that will help us balance and hopefully grow back from there. But it's really hard. It's really hard to predict in this environment, I think. But I think cautious optimism. We're seeing the XBI is performing better than we've seen in a while. We're looking to see where it lands at the end of the year, and we're hopeful that it will continue on the trend it's on now, and that's relevant for the public companies and certainly plays well for future public companies. And I'd like to believe it's a predictor for the privates, but it may have less relevance to the very early stage nucleate type companies. They may be more affected by the current NIH situation. And the sentiments over sort of the favored few are going to still be able to get out. But what about the ones that, are falling behind? And that's what I worry about. I think we're going to lose a lot of really good ideas. But I think in maybe 3 to 5 years, do I see a healthy biotech sector? I do, but I think it could take a while to get there.
I think my only question on that would be, is there anything that you have already spoken to other CEOs and leaders about that would help build or heal a positive relationship between science and the public?
Yeah, I think there's a couple initiatives afoot right now. I think there's a lot of work going on with education of legislation. So people are going down to DC and talking to legislators about what we're doing, or their staff. There's work at the Massachusetts House that's ongoing as well, talking to folks there. The Drive campaign initiative is ongoing now. I think that could make a big difference here in Massachusetts. And there's no patient left behind, right? Which has a really interesting kind of campaign that they're launching focused around what they're calling a marketing campaign, capital M, capital A for Massachusetts, really working to help people better understand who we are as an industry. Like, what is it that we're doing for the greater good, right? Why is it that drug prices are a part of the story, but biotech is something very different? And how do we reconcile that? And there's a lot of discussion about how that could roll out. Do we start following the stories of biotech very differently and helping people understand what happens to a company like Q32 when the placebo blows up your trial, right? What happens there, and what does it take then to grow that asset back up and eventually help people? That will be part, hopefully, of the success story of bempikibart one day when it hits the market and helps, tons of people. And many of the drugs that patients take on a daily basis have stories just like that, right? Of failures along the way and almost at the brink of abandonment, and suddenly something happens and they come back. And I think the more we tell those stories to people so they understand what we're doing and why it takes so long, perhaps that is one piece of the puzzle. So No Patient Left Behind has that initiative that they're launching now. They're doing some great work with that and also doing a lot of education of both folks in DC and here at home in Massachusetts. So, I'm encouraged. There's a lot of work going on in the sector. My belief, and I think the belief of the Public Policy Committee and many members of the CEO Forum, is, we tend to take an agnostic position when it comes to politics, and it's something we have to be very thoughtful about as in particular as public companies where your investors can be anyone from any walk of life with any view politically. But I think we can't be silent on the things that impact our industry, and we have to do our part to try to move things forward. And I think that's really where we're coming into it and trying to think about where are the places we can work to educate the public, educate our peers, have talking points we can all use that are consistent. Because just telling people it costs a lot of money and takes a lot of time to develop a drug, it's not cutting it. We got to do a lot better than that to explain why people can't afford their medication. Right? There's a lot more to that story. And we need to do our part to make sure our piece of that puzzle is both optimized for how we're contributing to it, and we fix anything where we are contributing in a way we don't want to, but also optimize how we're explaining the work that we're actually doing.
Definitely. Good scientific communication, and also communicating impact. You've talked so much this whole time about how it's really about the patients and about improving the health of so many different people and communities. So I really appreciate that perspective from you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I was recently at a meeting with somebody from Massachusetts, a legislator from Massachusetts, whose name I won't use just because I don't know how public her story is. But she stood up and she said, "Listen, I go and I get one medication every week that's keeping me alive as a cancer patient, and someday that's not going to work, right? And I'm going to need the next drug. And if we're not focused on making sure that next drug gets over the line, that's what we need to be focused on." And I feel like that's what I wake up thinking about every day. I'm a cancer survivor myself. I think about this a lot. It's super important for people that we keep things going forward, and that we don't lose these great ideas on the vine because we either can't fund them or the grant funding falls through. We're just delaying these future assets. I still believe they'll be developed someday, but if they're developed 10 or 20 years later, how do we feel about the people we're going to lose in between now and then, or the quality of life people will lose between now and then? And I think everyone on all works can think about that, right? It doesn't matter what side of this argument you're on. If you think about your family members, you want those drugs over the line. And I think we've got to focus people on that. So we focus on the patient messaging, and people focus on the patients in their lives, right? We need to get everybody thinking that way.
Definitely. Well, I think that's a great point to end on, is the patient impact and how we can get more people thinking through that orientation. From there, I'll go into our list of rapid fire questions for you. So the first one is, what is one hobby outside of biotech that brings you joy?
Hiking.
Hiking. Amazing. What is the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Oof. It's not a job if you love what you're doing.
If you could have any superpower, what would it be?
Oh, go back in time, certainly, right? Like fix anything you did wrong the last time, make things move faster by avoiding mistakes. Totally.
And which women leaders in biotech do you look to for inspiration?
Oh, there's a lot. There's so many. Well, obviously, Deborah Dunsire's on that list. Adeline Perkins, I would put on that list. Angie Yu, the work she's done with the Sisterhood, Julia and Sheila as well, who are the Sisterhood founders with her. Ivana Magosevich-Levich, who's just a beast when it comes to getting deals done. She's unbelievable, so fierce. Cheryl Blanchard over at, and Renee Russo. There's a lot of female leaders I would name that I look up to and learn from every day.
That's great to hear. And to the point, the CEO Sisterhood sounds like really robust community out there for female leaders, and glad you all are giving back to the next generation of female leaders that are coming up. So last question that we ask almost all of our guests is, what is one book you would recommend to our audience?
Unbroken, which is the book about the World War II runner who became a soldier who got lost at sea, went through unbelievable challenges, and came out the other side. I think it just is such a perseverance story. One foot in front of the other, and just keep, eye on the prize, which in that case I think was freedom and getting back to his family. But it's quite a story. So I would say that's the one.
And perseverance is definitely key in biotech, as we've all highlighted already. So very important to highlight that. Well, on that note, Jodie, thank you so much for joining the Nucleate podcast. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate your time. Very nice to meet you both.
Thanks for listening to the Nucleate podcast. Be sure to subscribe if you'd like to keep up with future episodes. See you next time.